Victoria Station, one of the iconic London mainline stations, and it was here in 1957, in spring 1957, that the soon-to-be globally famous writer Jack Kerouac arrived on the train, having caught the ferry from France, from Dieppe, and after some troubles with customs, got on a train to London and entered London here at Victoria Station. Kerouac spent a couple of days in London, and he recorded an account of it in this book here, The Lonesome Traveler, which is the book I took with me when I went travelling just over 30 years ago. And this was my companion on my first big backpacking trip. And this was part of Kerouac's big trip that he took. He set off in February 1957 from New York, and I'll tell you more about it as we go, but the significance of it was On the Road, the book for which Kerouac became globally famous, was published in September that year after this trip had concluded. So it's a real kind of boundary point in Kerouac's life where he went from obscurity to fame. And we're going to be following Kerouac's footsteps on the walk that he took when he arrived here at Victoria in spring 1957. It's a great walk from here across London in true Kerouacian beatnik style. It's great. I'll talk about Kerouac, London in 1957 and all that, but we need to get moving, I feel. It's a real place of transit, Victoria Station, as it would have been then for Kerouac. And Kerouac writes about how some of the students from his train from Dieppe were met by limousines here at Victoria Station. There's no one being met by a limousine today. A few people getting in black cabs, but that's it. The Shakespeare pub here, a real Victoria landmark. Pack on back, excited, I started walking in the gathering dusk down Buckingham Palace Road, seeing for the first time long deserted streets. Paris is a woman, but London is an independent man puffing his pipe in a pub. If I had to pick one book that changed my life, it was Jack Kerouac's book On the Road. And when it was published in 1957, it was an instant sensation. It's one of the examples we use of the idea of overnight fame. Kerouac became famous overnight. He went from complete obscurity to almost global fame with enthusiastic reviews, but it was also the birth of a movement, the beatnik movement, the beats, the beat, a whole attitude to going off on the road, where Kerouac recounts the story of his journey across America with Neil Cassidy. It gives birth to the idea of the beat generation. The beat generation, that comes into popular use with the publication of On the Road just after, months after Kerouac's visit to London. When he was walking these streets, he had no idea of what was about to come, the fame that was about to be visited upon him. And it became a huge inspiration for a whole generation of people. It was a whole attitude to travel. And it's one of the things that made me feel like I had to go off on my own on the road, find my own Route 66. I read it, it's almost like a cliche really. I read it, just finished my degree, I had no work, nowhere to go, stay with some friends in their flat in Hackney. And it made up my mind. I had to go on the road myself. I had to go and find my own adventure, my own journey, and be beat with just a backpack on my back. And when I looked at the book again this morning, I found something very special in the back of this book from that time. The bookmark at the back of my book is a red weekly travel pass for the Sydney transport system. This is my bus pass in Sydney. And it made me realise I arrived in Sydney almost 30 years ago to the day. I arrived there right at the end of January, early February. Again, part of the events that changed my life. It was travelling that changed my life. But would I have done it if I hadn't read On the Road? I'm not entirely sure. So it's enormously significant for me, and this is a real treasured little artefact. What's the betting I lose it on the walk today? And this would have been Kerouac's first view of Buckingham Palace, wouldn't it? You always imagine it approached from the Mall, that impressive view from the front. But of course, if you come from Victoria Station, this is the first view you would get of Buckingham Palace. Nowhere near as impressive, is it? Kerouac deals with the next section of the walk in one sentence: past the palace, down the Mall, through St James's Park to the Strand. I think he's probably got that in slightly the wrong order, but I would say it's through St James's Park and down the Mall to the Strand, but I'm not going to disagree with Jack Kerouac. Queen Elizabeth II had only been on the throne 5 years when Kerouac visited. Kerouac died in, off the top of my head, 1968, 1969. Queen Elizabeth II reigned until 2022, which is an incredible thought, really. Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister that year to be replaced by Harold Macmillan, who famously declared that most of the people in our country have never had it so good. So we'll go down the Mall with St James's Park on our right. And there is a dedicated video on my channel about this area. I do love St James's Park, one of my favourites. And this part of the walk from Victoria Station up through here is pretty much the same as it would have been when Kerouac did it in 1957. Apart, of course, from the famous London fog, which while he was in Paris, Kerouac was really looking forward to experiencing the London fog that would bring back old London fog, which of course was dealt with by the Clean Air Act. When you look at photos of London in 1957, it's still very much a city of bomb sites. There are bomb sites everywhere. There's also a lot of rebuilding going on, and I'll talk more about that later. But it was a city where it was still recovering from the war. There were bomb sites. It was a smoky, smoggy city. There was still petrol rationing caused by the Suez crisis, which did end later that year. So when Harold Macmillan said that people had never had it so good, I guess he was comparing it to the previous 10 to 15 years of the war, the rationing, and everything that brought with it. And people were starting to look forward a bit more and be a bit more optimistic. I don't know. I wasn't even an idea in 1957. Some of you would have been alive then. It's interesting to look at the people born in 1957, very contemporary figures. The one that stuck out for me, funnily enough, was Brian Robson, the Man United footballer. Tommy Steele was at #1 with Singin' the Blues, and Lonnie Donegan also had a #1 hit with Cumberland Gap. It's also the year that The Bridge on the River Kwai was released, David Lean's classic film. We'll forgive the great Jack Kerouac for getting his geography slightly wrong. He talks about going down the Mall to the Strand, then Trafalgar Square to Fleet Street. But of course, we've got Trafalgar Square here, and then the Strand. So what he really meant was the Mall, Trafalgar Square, the Strand, and then Fleet Street, which is where we're going next. The Kerouac writes, through St James's Park to the Strand, traffic and fumes and shabby English crowds going out to the movies. Trafalgar Square onto Fleet Street, where there was less traffic and dimmer pubs and sad side alleys, almost clear to St Paul's Cathedral. I mean, there would be a lot of traffic and fumes in the Strand today, but the roads are closed for the big protest in Trafalgar Square, so it's quite unrepresentative of what it's normally like. And the built fabric down here would again largely be the same as what it was in 1957 when Kerouac did his walk. There's an interesting clip on YouTube of a dinner that was held in 1957. It's part of a series called The Changing Face of London, which I don't know if it has anything to do with the book by Harold P. Clun called The Changing Face of London. But in that, it's a dinner hosted by an estate agent called Joseph Levy, who was celebrating 10 years of building in London. 10 years of where they had built 2.5 million square feet of new office buildings, mostly in the London Borough of Westminster, replacing buildings which were shabby, outdated, or completely destroyed by bombing. That's a quote. And they had another 3.5 million square feet under construction, and all these kind of dignitaries were coming to celebrate this at the time. So it gives you an idea of what was going on in London in 1957, the scale of the rebuilding that was taking place. And also you can imagine maybe some of the deals that were being struck there when it was well, I like to say it was a much more of an opaque world, because they talk about these things in London. Development can only be done in a very public way, which is interesting. But the use of the word shabby by Kerouac describes the people as shabby. In a film released in the same year, they describe as some of the buildings of London being shabby. And what we know now is a lot of those buildings that were replaced were actually quite precious historic buildings that they regarded as being shabby and outdated. So a lot of crimes against heritage and architecture were being performed in 1957 as well. The Savoy down there, one of the grandest hotels in London. I've had tea there with some interesting company. It's not a story I'm going to tell. Actually, it wasn't tea. I had a drink there with Noel Gallagher and David Icke. Hopefully, most of you will be thinking I'm making that up. I'll leave it up to you to decide. By the way, if that ever did take place, it took place quite a while ago. I think 2013, I want to say. Yeah. But maybe it didn't happen at all. Maybe I made it up. Lyceum Tavern over there. It's a fine Sam Smith's pub on the Strand. It used to be one of my go-to drinking holes in the West End, although I haven't been in there for, I don't know, quite a while. Kerouac's big trip was, I think, a lot of it revolved around visiting William Burroughs. Some of you will be aware of William Burroughs. Hopefully, most of you. I'm going to reframe this shot, actually. William Burroughs, who was at that point, like Kerouac, quite obscure. I can't remember the publication date of The Naked Lunch, but Burroughs was in Tangier, so that was Kerouac's first stop, was Tangier. And then from Tangier and Morocco, I think he goes to Casablanca. I'm not sure if he goes to Marrakesh. And then he goes by boat to Marseille and works his way up through France to Paris. I don't think he seems to stay in Paris very long. And then he gets the ferry from Dieppe. But there's a funny story in here. Well, when he arrives in England, I don't think he mentions the port. I can't see a mention of the port, but let's assume it's Dover, because he talks about the White Cliffs and all of that. Is the customs officer at first don't think he's legit. He's got 15 shillings in his pocket, or the equivalent of. He's unshaven, he's got a knapsack, and so he tells them he's an author, that he's coming to pick up a royalty check from his publisher before getting the boat to New York. They don't believe him. And then eventually he says, look, there's an article written by about me and Henry Miller, and I think it's an interview or maybe a conversation between the two of them, and he's got the magazine article with him, and they laugh and they say, oh, actually we stopped Henry Miller here a few years ago, because that's when Miller's books were still banned in the United Kingdom. The Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn were considered obscene texts, and that bit of recognition that they'd also harassed Henry Miller, they see the article, they see the mention of Kerouac and the photograph of Kerouac alongside Miller, and they let him through. They have a bit of a laugh about it. I think they say something like, now it's time for smiles and handshakes as we part, and Kerouac then is free to get on the train and come to London. It's a lovely little story, isn't it? Henry Miller is also another favourite of mine. The Kerouac mentions Fleet Street by name. He doesn't really mention anything about the buildings at all. And that's not really his style of writing, to be honest with you. It's more about the rhythm of it, capturing the atmosphere of something, the experience of passing through a place. He's not going to give you kind of historical background or anything like that. It's more about a vibe, so to speak. And in fact, if I use that language, it's probably because that's Kerouacian language, if that's the correct adjective. And there is a dedicated Fleet Street video on my channel, which is actually, incidentally, the most viewed video on my channel. So I imagine a lot of you have already seen it. St Dunstan's in the west, very fine church full of mythology. Features in the Fleet Street video, but then also a video just about that church. I discovered a couple of years ago that one of my ancestors got married in that church, or I should say two of my ancestors got married in that church. One of them was an immigrant from Normandy, and they were living in the parish at the time of their marriage. Dropping down now into the valley of the River Fleet, with St Paul's Cathedral there looming on the distant hill. I walked down here with Ian Sinclair and Stephen McNeely, and this building site here was just an empty plot. So that's made progress. And that was exactly 2 years ago, I think, that walk, January 2023, yeah. And it's on that walk that Ian pointed out the King Lud pub, and that Kerouac had gone there for a Welsh rarebit and a stout. I'll check the drink in the book when we get there. St Bride's Church there, which is in the Fleet Street video, with its wedding cake tower. And I wonder what kind of view you would have got from here of the glorious dome of St Paul's Cathedral in 1957, what with all the smoke and the smog and the thick pollution. It would have just been peering up above that kind of grey sludge, I would have thought. So the Leon restaurant over there is on the site of the King Lud pub, where Kerouac turned back for St Paul's after getting so Johnsonianly sad. He turned back, he writes, "So I turned back tired and went into the King Lud pub for a sixpenny Welsh rarebit and a stout." You'd have to have a burger in there today, and I don't know, they might serve stout, oddly enough. We will continue up Ludgate Hill to the end of the walk, the end of Kerouac's walk, and I'll tell you more about what he did after he left the King Lud pub. So this is where Kerouac's initial walk ended here at St Paul's Cathedral, and when he refers to being Johnsonian, I'm struggling to pronounce that, but Johnsonian sad, I guess he must mean Dr. Samuel Johnson, I suppose. So after Kerouac has his Welsh rarebit and his pint of stout down there at the King Lud, he calls his British agent because he needs some money, and he catches the bus back to Buckingham Gate, basically retracing his steps, where his agent is there in a very grand flat with his mother, and he lends him some money, and then Kerouac goes off and explores Chelsea in the fog. He stays in a hotel in Coventry Street, right near Leicester Square. The hotel is still there. It's now the Thistle Piccadilly. And the next day he goes to the British Museum. He has a look for some records of his ancestors in the British Museum. I guess that's when the British Library was housed there. And from there he goes to the theatre, goes down to Waterloo to catch the train to Southampton, discovers the Old Vic. I think he sees a play at the Old Vic. It's not entirely clear. What does he say about the next day? There's a lovely description of Chelsea. After he was fed sandwiches by his agent, the bobbies wandering. Then I then walked around London, savouring the fog in Chelsea. The bobbies wandering in the milky mist, thinking who will strangle the bobby in the fog. The dim lights, the English soldier strolling with one arm around his girl and the other hand eating fish and chips, the honk of cabs and buses, Piccadilly at midnight, and a bunch of teddy boys asking me if I knew Jerry Mulligan. Isn't that great? I finally got a 15 bob room in the Mapleton Hotel in the attic, and had a long divine sleep with the window open in the morning, the carillons blowing all of an hour around 11, and the maid bring up a tray of toast, butter, marmalade, hot milk and a pot of coffee as I laid there amazed. So it was Good Friday. He comes back to St Paul's Cathedral for a performance of the St Matthew Passion by the choir. Outside, he leaves St Paul's Cathedral after the performance. Outside, as I walked in the dusk around Christopher Wren's great masterpiece and saw the gloomy, overgrown ruins of Hitler's Blitz around the cathedral, I saw my own mission. Wow, it doesn't say what the mission is. Is that where he sees the mission of his career as a writer? That's amazing. Anyway, so he goes to a play at the Old Vic, sees a performance of Antony and Cleopatra, and then catches the boat to the train to Southampton, the boat back to New York. And like I say, within a few months of him arriving back in New York, he becomes famous as the author of On the Road and as the creator, if you like, or the defining voice of the Beat generation. Wow, what a great journey with Jack Kerouac. Right, I'm going to go and find a Welsh rarebit and a pint of stout. Thanks for joining me on that Jack Kerouac Beat Generation walk in London. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I've been wanting to do this walk for a couple of years. Got great stuff coming up for you this year. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you enjoy coming on these journeys with me. So, as I always like to say, I look forward to seeing you on the next walk, wherever that may be.
It's over the meadow, over the stream, it's where I am going and where I have been. It's been a long day now, it's time for a beer, and now for home, of course I must steer. It's over the meadow, over the stream, I hope you are pleased with what you have seen.